So I'm trying to get in, and I left with Diane saying, you can't tell it all. And that was always what she said before preaching. So anyhow, thanks to the great staff here that works with communication. We have Amos back there, and Rachel, I think, did a lot of the work on these slides, and so we just have a great team there. So here's that your trip. Now I had a title, but they, I think, edited out. But the title is Jericho Cake and Jericho People, and I hope that will make sense in a minute. Just to give a sense of the size of Israel, it's amazing how compact that strip of land is. It is comparable. Now, this looks a little longer, and these aren't exactly to scale, but from the top to the bottom of Israel, it's like from Birmingham to Gulf Shores. The width at the widest place would be something like Birmingham to Heflin, or the Georgia line. So just it's an amazing piece of geography, because it's said that from wherever you are in the world, you can likely find something that's familiar to you in this area. Up north you have mountains, snow-capped, you can go skiing. Down here you have desert, you have wilderness, you have the Jordan River flowing from the top of Mount Hermon in the Golan Mountains, and it goes into the Kinneth, and then to Galilee, and then all the way through here to the Dead Sea. If you like beach, here it is. You've got wilderness, hills and gulches. You've got more flat desert here. Up here in the Galilee is, think about North Alabama. Those fields, if you've ever driven around Morgan County or Madison County, just almost year-round planting. And if you go there, and my experience is, the food is wonderful. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit. You will eat well, and so in that place, you've just about got anything, from snow to desert to beach to mountains to beautiful farmland. And if you got your globe, and this may not be exactly, but really, these are fairly close on latitude. So it's Alabama doesn't have quite the variation, but as the globe, as the world turns, anybody remember, as the world turns? My grandmother wouldn't miss it. And so just some sense of the proportion and relation to us. When you go to the Holy Land, you will likely fly in from the west and Tel Aviv, and getting on and off planes in Israel is a very interesting thing. You don't go up to the terminal. You're out on the tarmac, and they bus you in and bus you out. And I'm not sure where your itinerary has you, but you will either be bused to maybe Jerusalem or up to the Galilee. And I remember the first time some friends went, whether it was a study group of ministers, we're friends pretty much. And so we'd been flying all night, and we got off the plane in Tel Aviv, and it was early morning. We were groggy and sleepy, and we're driving out of Tel Aviv, and they're taking us to Jerusalem. And this guy I'm sitting with, you might know Gary Formby, one of the Methodist ministers, and he said, "Wow, we're in the Holy Land." And he looked and he said, "And it looks a lot like Tarrant City." Okay. When you go to the Holy Land, that's the way you will enter. Now, if you were coming into what we have come to call the Holy Land with General Joshua. I picture him a little bit looking like Indiana Jones, which is a new movie coming out, Intrepid Architect. And they have been trekking around the Sinai, the wilderness for 40 years. It took 40 years to make a 40-day journey, so they've been doing donuts. And so when they come in up this way, they get to a ford, a natural ford in the Jordan River, and right here is Jericho. And there's a sort of a natural break in the craggy hills there. Sometimes they're called a wadi, a gulch, a ravine, a gorge. And here is Jericho. So centuries before, when the people who came and settled in there that called themselves a Canaanite, they came that way. When the Israelites came that way, all through history, when people were coming from Asia to the north or Egypt to the south, they would generally go into this area at Jericho. And let's see, this is the modern city of Jericho, and it is fairly underwhelming. Not exactly like Tarrant City, but that kind of feel. It has, I'm told by Paul McCracken, is Paul here? Oh, good, because he knows so much more about this. And I would embarrass myself, and I was going to ask Paul just to raise a hand if I get really off track. But anyway, Paul says there is a good three-level restaurant in Jericho. And Jericho, back in ancient days, was a crossroads, going and coming. It still is now. It was one of the main places if you were coming up from the north and going to Jerusalem for the high holy days, like Jesus and his family when he was 12 years old. You came in there at this area of Jericho. There was a casino there in the 1990s, but I think it didn't work out, so you won't be tempted to play the slots in Jericho. But it continues to be something of a crossroads. And so, as I said, it's sort of underwhelming itself, but you more than likely will hear your guide or someone say that in the Holy Land there are 5 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they will say the 5th Gospel is the land, is the geography. It tells the story. It's sort of a silent witness. It takes some detective work. But there is, within 4 miles of Jericho is the Jordan River. Well, that looks pretty unspoiled, and up and down the Jordan River it's more developed than others, but Jesus, we believe, not too far from Jericho, was baptized in the Jordan River. Now, a lot of people, when they go to Israel, want to bring some Jordan River water home. Okay, let me tell you how to do that. Go into your hotel bathroom and go to the lavatory and get a little bottle and turn the water on, and you will have some Jordan River water, because that's basically the water system in Israel. Just think of all the things you've read about and studied about that has something about the Jordan. This is a shot of the Judean wilderness. Jesus, it said, spent 40 days and night in the wilderness. Now, when I was growing up, I pictured the wilderness, it's like a desert, The Judean wilderness is craggy, it's scruffy, it has plants, it has a lot of up and down. So some of the hills are so close together, the sun hardly ever falls into those crevices, and they call those the Valley of the Shadows. And in those times when you had shepherds out on the Judean wilderness trying to find food for their flocks, it said that the sheep were pretty good about following the shepherd. They were not as smart as the goats. And the goats, though, were not smart enough to follow the shepherd, and that oftentimes the goats would get ahead of the shepherds, and you would often find their carcasses in the valley of the shadows. So when you talk about, yea, though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, there is a geographical reference there. There's a spiritual reference for sure. And so the Judean wilderness, it's craggy, gulchy, scrappy area, is really not that big. Now, if you're on foot, walking 35 miles seems like a long way, doesn't it? If you're on foot, walking the 17 miles, it is. So that's a big space for people who are on foot, or on camel, I guess. And yet, the Judean wilderness, in which Jericho is located, Jerusalem is on the edge of it, is not quite the size of Jefferson County. Go figure. Now, sort of to the north of where Jericho is and was, is this cliff, and it's called the Mount of Temptation. And you can see this from Jericho. And through the centuries, they have built some monasteries up there. And believe it or not, some guys and I somehow got up there, and nobody was there. And so we came back down. And in the stories of our faith, it said that Jesus spent some time up on this mount, which is in the Judean wilderness. Part of what makes Jericho through the ages amazing is that it is close to water at just 4 miles away from the Jordan River, 10 miles away from the Dead Sea, which there's just all kinds of story about the Dead Sea. But the Jericho area had really 5 underground, natural, bubbly, generous water springs. The main one is sometimes called Ain es Sultan, which is more of an Arabic way of saying it, or Elisha's spring. There's a story in the Old Testament where Elisha helps purify the water in Jericho. Now, this is like a picture, maybe the way it looked in 1800s. This is a place it looks like in Jericho today, so it's sort of very touristy there. But it's just on the top of a wonderful irrigation system, because Jericho is actually an oasis in an otherwise arid area. It's in the Bible itself. It's called the City of the Palms. It raises pineapples and figs and bananas and all kinds of good fruit. Like I said, while you're in Israel, you're going to get good food.
Do they have an aqueduct or something from?
There is an aqueduct, and I don't remember the details, but there's an aqueduct and there's irrigation. And
Would there have been back then?
I'm not sure when the aqueduct was put in. I know the Romans were big on aqueducts. I don't know if before then it was, but that's good. Give me a minute, I'll Google it. And so 15 miles, what time is it? 15 miles uphill from Jericho is Jerusalem. And the significance of going up to Jerusalem is both a geographical thing, but it's also a spiritual thing. The idea that when you were going to Jerusalem for the High Holy Days, Passover, Pentecost, all the others, that you were going up. You were going up to Zion. And there's a hill in Jerusalem called Zion. So it's geographically up. You know, I will lift up my eyes to the hills from which comes my strength. They're going to Jerusalem. That's what they're talking about. And so just there. So as I said, the modern day Jericho is pretty underwhelming. But it's like a lot of people. If you just look at me or you, we may come across as underwhelming. But if you really get to know somebody, you kind of go deep, it gets more whelming. Sorry, Betty. She's my grammar coach, and it's not working. And so, so that's been kind of a horizontal thing. But it gets amazing. And all right, my clicker. Let's see. There it is. What gets amazing is to understand Jericho from the vertical. Archaeologists, historians, people like that have discerned that there are likely layers of settlements at the site of Old Jericho, which is a little different from New Jericho, which is a little different from New Testament Jericho. They're all walking distance. Is that there were at least 20 layers of people who live there. And the best they can figure out, 8,000, not 800, 8,000 BC. Some say 7,500 BC, but we're not going to fight over 500 years. And so for me, I'm always looking for something I can see. And so somebody else may have thought about this, but this just came to me, is to get a feel for Jericho and really other places in Israel. I mean, it's true at Jerusalem, it's true in Galilee, but none go as deep. Over 8,000 years before Jesus, there were people living at Jericho. There's been 2,000 years since Jesus. So there were more years before Jesus at Jericho than years after Jesus at Jericho. So just that kind of makes my mind twirl a little more than usual. And so I thought that a layer cake would be a great image. Okay. I bet some of you know what you call an archaeological mound that has those layers in it. A tail. Did you say a tail? Did you say a tail? Okay. You can spell it with one or two L's. But that is a human construct. Do you remember when I went to elementary school in Birmingham, and the big thing was to go to Moundville? I mean, this is a lot more classy than Moundville. This is an aerial view of Tel Jericho. It's about a mile or so from modern Jericho. This is the site of the Jerichos through the ages. Now, if you're really into it, you can study the Neolithic and the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age and the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. These different layers of settlers. That's an ancient. Well, that's an architectural artist's imaginative view of what it looked like. To give you some perspective on the size of this tail, and it's 22 layers or so. And what time do we go to?
You go till like quarter after.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll get you up by 10:30. No. I was trying to. It says. Most say it's about 10 acres by 80 feet. Okay, so I called Jeff Stone, who was the building guy when we did all the renovation and new building a few years ago, and I said, Jeff, what around here would be about 80 feet, to get the depth? And we talked, and he said, well, I think it would be about twice the height of the sanctuary, but you probably need to check with Thomas DeWine, who's our terrific building man. And so Thomas did me drawings. And so if you go and stand in the parking lot, well, not the parking lot, the driveway between the sanctuary and the chapel, and you look at the ground and go all the way up to the roof line and double it, that's the height of this. It's 20 or so layers of people who live there across thousands and thousands of years. And so, if you want to know how high the top of the steeple is, just add 10 more feet. That's 90 feet. So 80 feet, 90 feet. All right. I had fun with trying to calculate what 10 acres would be like. I thought, okay, this is Alabama, football people. And so imagine 8 football fields. Kind of imagine them in pairs, like 2, 4, 6, 8. And that's about that. So 2 sanctuaries deep by 8 football fields, but they're like 2 by 2 by 2. And so really big in some ways and maybe not that big otherwise. And so that is an artist's view, and I'm not sure what time in history that is depicted from. But if you have any kind of interest in archaeology, which is a kind of it's kind of a scientific detective work thing. I mean, good biblical study is a kind of detective work. Good theology is a good kind of life detective work. Good historians are good detectives. Good architects, good archaeologists, well, architects do, but archaeologists are. And so there are just zillions of pictures from the tale. I'm not going to show you all of them. But notice the thing I wanted to show here is they can tell the age of things because now they've settled, you know. Earthquakes and fires and battles and erosion, and so it's not quite as pretty of a cake as that cake I showed you. It's sort of, you know, scrunched. What are those cakes that look like a bunch of pancakes? Anyway, but walls and structures that look like this tend to be considered older. In later time, you know, give 1,000 or 2 years, they began to do construction with mud brick. And so that the detectives will tell you, and like I said, they can tell you, well, about 3,500 so-and-so, and then 2,500 so-and-so. If you can find that if you want to know it. One of the most interesting things that you can see is, whoops, excuse me, that's interesting too, but not yet, is this round object. Now, if you go to the archaeological stuff, you may or may not, I don't know, but when you look down at that, you've got to understand 10,000 years ago, you would be looking up at this. It was a tower close to the wall at that time of Jericho. It was almost 30 feet high. What would that be, about twice that? I'm not sure. Inside, there are 22 steps. It's 30 feet wide, and it tapers to about 7 feet on the top. And so it was probably a guard place to look out and see who's coming. They think it was also done to just sort of communicate the prominence of Jericho. It was something not just for defense, but also of pride, and perhaps had something to do with the indigenous religion there, which was of Jerosh, Jericho, the moon goddess. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, if I can get in before 10:15. All right, there you go. You can tell the ages and the stages of these layers by what you can deduce from the burial practices, the building practices, and so, and the pottery and other things too. But this might very well be a death mask. Some of the earlier people there, the way they honored their dead was to take their skull and put plaster on them and keep them. And that may sound strange, but that, I can imagine that. Later on, the pottery became more sophisticated, and I don't think that's. I hope no one looked like that. I think that's just pottery. All right, so we have done probably the fastest historical archaeological tour of Jericho that has ever happened. And so there's a whole lot of that elephant that's running behind the Mini Cooper that didn't get in. Now, what I wanted to do for the other side of this, you remember I said I wanted the title to be Jericho Cake, all kind of layers in the history. I'm talking about now what I want to call Jericho people. People who may seem different, have a lot of layers, and this amazing way God uses the layers and the different ways people's lives are put together. We're going to look, if time permits, to 4 episodes of Jericho people. Joshua and Rahab and the fall of Jericho. We're going to take a little bit of a look at the blind guy sitting by the road in Jericho who Jesus gave him his sight. We're going to talk about the Good Samaritan, not the whole thing, but the part of it where the guy is on the road down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he gets beat up. All kind of significance. And the 4th one, we're going to talk about Zacchaeus, who was a wee little man. And there was some dispute here at Canterbury about, was Jesus short or was it Zacchaeus was short that caused him to climb up in the tree? And I had Betty Gunn work it out, and I'll tell you about that later. All right, Joshua 1 through 6 could be it would be a better mini series than a movie. I mean, you got drama there. It's amazing. And I can't tell you it all, and Diane told me not to tell you it all because it is not PG. There's some R in there. And so, but you generally remember the story. All these folks have been trekking around the wilderness from Egyptian bondage. They camp on the other side of the Jordan. Then they camp on the Jericho side of the Jordan, and they decide their plan to get into Canaan, the Promised Land. Now, of course, they're going to find out there's people already in Canaan who hadn't heard the news that this is our land coming in, and so there were a lot of battles. And so you remember the story. They march around Jericho once a day for 7 days, and on the 7th day they do it twice. And we don't know exactly what happened, but at some level it may just have psyched out the Jerichoans. And the Israelites, by the way, had no offensive weapons. They didn't have battle rams, or they generally were defensive people. They did not tend to start wars. That's probably not totally true, but generally. And so, following what they understood as God's leadership, they do this. And on the 7th day, on the second time around, they blow their horns. And I don't know if you've ever been on 280 and everybody's blowing their horns. That makes me want to do something crazy. And so, whatever happened, the walls fell. Some speculation is, by the way, the walls, I didn't say that, the walls they think were about 12 to 14 feet high. And there were a series of walls, and there's all kind of debate what kind of wall, if there was a wall at this time. And the walls at that point would have been of mud, brick, and they were real wide. They could be 10, 15, 20 feet wide. And there's some speculation that all the Jerichoans got up on the wall because they were so psyched out and the walls fell. Or there was just in the right time an earthquake. We don't know. But that's the great story of that. But to me, the part of the story I like, do you remember the spies? They send 2 spies in to check out Jericho. And I guess these are soldiers. And where do they go? They went to Madam Rahab's, the best little gentleman's club in Jericho. There's an alternative view to that I'm going to tell you in a minute. But as the story goes, Rahab, who was called a prostitute, I think King James called her a harlot, and the oldest profession in the world, all that stuff. And she took them in and helped them get some intel on Jericho. The king finds out they're there, staying with Rahab. He talks to Rahab, and Rahab says, "No, I hadn't seen them. I think they left." And then she secretly lets them out, into the red cord over the side and the sign. And so, in the fullness of it, when the Israelites victoriously conquer Jericho, and it's a rout, Rahab and her family are brought safely out. Okay, some thoughts about that. Remember I said that they think that Jericho was named after an ancient moon goddess, Jerah. The ancient people noticed that the moon had a 29.5-day cycle. Anybody see the moon last night? It's full. Beautiful. Somehow, even then, Beth, they figured out that women had a 29.5, 30-day cycle. And they, that must be the moon goddess. And sometimes in history she was known as Astarte. But as far as those ancient Canaanites were concerned, they had a kind of worship of the moon goddess. And the moon goddess was thought to be the goddess of fertility. And so if you had good worship in the moon goddess faith, then you counted on good crops, lots of livestock, lots of children. Now, you might not have thought this, but somehow back then they thought, well, maybe we can incorporate some sexual ritual in our worship. And in that, incorporate perhaps some temple prostitutes. I don't know how that made the crops. It may, I don't know if it, maybe it helped increase attendance. But the thought is that Rahab may very well have been a temple prostitute. And in that context, probably was recruited, didn't volunteer, probably was a woman without any advocates, and then just were used. And so she was probably not a vixen. She was probably a victim. And you can understand how perhaps, back to those 2 soldiers, it implies that they treated her with respect and a dignity that she had not experienced in her own community. And that's why she said, well, let me help you. That's why when they came, they rescued Rahab and her family, and she became a part of the Israelites. And that's not all. In Matthew, there's this amazing genealogy. In Matthew, as far as we know, it's the only genealogy in the ancient world that included women. And not just one, but 4. It'll take me a minute. Tamar, was she an Egyptian? Laura, you know, I don't remember, but she was a foreigner. And there was Ruth, who was a Moabitess. There was Bathsheba, who was a Hittite, and also named is Rahab, the Canaanite. And in the 11th chapter of Hebrew, when you have this heroes by faith, by faith, by faith, guess who's in that? Rahab. This God, way back, uses people that we would never expect. This God is looking for ways to include people, not exclude people. And from the very beginning, incorporates each of those 4 women who had a little bit of a story. Now, each of those women who had a little bit of story, you can track it back to the man. But, you know, that's not always popular. Let's just put it on the woman. But what a wonderful way to take a look, even in this story of Concord, the role that this brave, courageous person played. All right, let's see, I've got 8 minutes. I love the story of Bartimaeus. Jesus is going through Jericho on the way to Jerusalem. Now, you know when Jesus is going to Jerusalem, you know what he's going for, don't you? He's going for a reckoning. He's not going for a vacation. It's all going to fall apart before it gets put back together again when Jesus is on the way to Jericho. But he's walking through Jericho, and this blind guy apparently can see things that the people with 20/20 sight can't see. Jesus, son of David, that's a messianic title. And Jesus, as you know, heals his sight. My favorite sight story, and Matthew, Luke also have a version of the Jericho sight. But my favorite sight one is in Matthew 8, where he's up near Galilee. Do you remember where the guy's blind and he makes the mud and spit, soltis, poultice, and he says, well, I can see, but it looks real blurry. And so Jesus touches him a second time. And so that to me that's what Jesus does to us all the time. Helps us see things that we have not seen before. And so for me, one of the great images of Jesus is the phylactery. Better? Not so good? Better? Not so good? To help us see. Good Samaritan people on the dangerous roads. Do y'all recognize Chris Brown's drawing? I love it. The theology of this is that the guy is paying for this guy's care. Because in those days, that hotel innkeeper would have been glad to take this guy for free. Because if he took him for free, then he would get him well and he would be his indentured slave, servant. But the guy says, no, I'll pay you when I get back if there's any more, because he helps him in a way that helps. Think of all the things you ever heard about the Good Samaritans. They were not our kind of people. They were the last people that you would think would be the hero in a story. And here's a picture of what the road down from Jericho. This is one you can hike. It's paved now, but where it really is. But in those days, it was like 15 miles straight down. So it was hard to go down. It was hard to go up. I got to walk on it one time with my minister friends. I slipped. They caught me. And that night, one of them said to the other, why did you catch him? Don't you know that people would be lining up to get to church at Tuscaloosa if he had gone over the cliff? That's where I was serving then. And so there's just all kinds of things to know about the Jericho road. Jesus, I mentioned earlier, was on the Jericho road when he was going up there. And usually when the groups were going up and down the Jericho road to the celebration at the temple, the children went with the women, and the men went with the men. And Jesus, being 12, came to age of accountability. In the custom, he would have likely then gone home with the men. But maybe they just got some confusion. So Mary thought Jesus was with Joseph and the guys. Joseph thought Jesus was with Jesus and the children and the women. And the story, they go back. And so the road to Jericho. Jesus is on this road. And my last but not least is the story of Zacchaeus, a wee little man. And he, as you know, climbed the tree to see Jesus. And this was in Jericho. Luke's kind of another account of Jesus on his way to Jerusalem to face the Messiah music. And the story is because he was short, he climbed the tree so he could see Jesus. One Sunday, I've just made the offside comment, maybe Jesus was short. And that's why Zacchaeus climbed the tree, because he couldn't see Jesus, because Jesus was short in the crowd. And so Monday morning, Betty Gunn brought me a correctly diagrammed sentence of that verse. And her conclusion was, all refer to Zach. So he was a short little man. As you remember, tax collectors were not sweet, cuddly guys. They got the franchise to collect the Roman taxes. And Jericho was a great tax place. People going in, going out, bringing stuff in, bringing stuff. I mean, it was a tax collector's haven, and they could collect more than they had to turn in, and they were just shysters. And he has this encounter with Jesus, and he says, "I'll give half of it. If I did anything wrong, I will replace him 4 times." Man, he did everybody wrong. And so if we had more time, I would use this place as a place to talk about business ethics. Whatever business you're in. A while back, I did some writing on integrity, and to me, the thing is that the basic ordination for Christians is baptism. The clergy ordination is a subset, but the baptism is our ordination is the baptism, and we're all ordained to be channels of God's love and care in all of our life, particularly with our work. And I did some thinking about what I call the ministry of competence, the ministry of encouragement, the ministry of chipping away, just hanging in there, the ministry of showing up, getting it done, the ministry of seeing Jesus' face, like Mother Teresa said. She could deal with all kinds of characters because she just thought about the face of Jesus. So that's our fast trip. And here, again, is the modern Jericho. And as we complete this, what I'd like for you to do in the next few days is to think about the layers of your life. You know, how did you get to where you are? There's probably some layers that were harder than others, some you're more proud of than others, but somehow God got you to this place. And also to be a bit more compassionate and understanding with people, particularly the ones who maybe get on our nerves or get our goats. Why are they that way? Maybe if the layers of my life had happened the way the layers of that person's life, I might not do as well as they do. And so the God of Jesus has his great way of helping good people find out they're not quite as good as they thought they were, and bad people probably better than we thought they were. And God loves us all, and God uses us all, and that is all. 10:15. They said it never could be done. All right, let them eat cake. Any other words?
Just please sign in if you haven't already, and if your name, if I didn't on there, just write it on somebody, so we've got all that. But thank you. We'll see you next week.
Thank
for our
you.
Next adventure.
Hey, man.
How are you?
I'm good. You bored with your work?
I got a question.
What's that?
Challenge, not bored.
I was sarcastic. I know you're not bored.
I'm excited to run on this track.
Oh, you'll love it. You will love it.
Hey, Diane.
I will.
So that hole in Jericho, you've been looking, all that dirt filled in. Where does the dirt come from? It just,
It's the resid. It's not like hauled in dirt. It's just the residue of that layer of habitation.
and so the population moves on and it's
Well,
eroded and
Well, there's a population there for, I don't know, a century or two. They get burned out, they get earthquakes, they go somewhere else, they get conquered, and it all just, and then a little bit later, say, well, let's build a place here. We got water here, we can grow stuff.
I can't relate to 4,000 years. I think of 75 years.
Yeah, and to think Jericho was around longer before Jesus than since Jesus. That just blows my mind. And so those are human layers. That was never dirt hauled in. It was just a residue of houses. And,
Roman like that.
well,
Dirt comes from everyday life, I think.
I neglected to say it, but the Old Testament part is about a mile from the New Testament. Because the Old Testament was destroyed by the Babylonians about 580, and then the Greeks.